Alright guys, hello. This is the second lecture that we're going to have about population ecology, where we talk about population size and specifically how we sample populations so that we can estimate that population size. You should have already by this time have seen the first lecture on population ecology where we talk about random sampling. If you haven't seen that lecture at this point, pause this video and go ahead and watch that video. Otherwise, let's move forward so we can move ahead and talk about another method of estimating population size. Before we go any further about talking about methods of estimating population size, we should track back for a second and talk about why it might be important at all to estimate population size. Why might an ecologist want to know how big populations are? Or a population of trees, or a population of fish, or a population of ants, or any kind of population? Why are population sizes so important to biologists? The answer to that question is simple. An ecologist wants to know how big populations are to ultimately, it tells us right here, as I move the page, let me turn to my pen, ecologists want to know about population sizes to determine if a biotic or abiotic factor is causing populations to increase or decrease. Well, here we go again with those terms, abiotic and biotic factors. That is to say, if something living is causing populations to change size, or if something non-living is causing populations to change size. So for example, I've given you some indications of what might cause populations to change size. Predation might be one of them, and we saw that in our deer and wolf population exercise last week, where we see that wolves cause decreased deer populations. So that's a biotic factor, so we'll call predation a biotic factor. Competition with other organisms might cause populations to change size. So that would be another biotic factor. Food availability. Whether there's enough food. Again, that would be probably another biotic factor. Food being a living thing. Food like plants. Food like other consumers, for example. Pollution. Obviously, air pollution, water pollution, sound pollution even might cause organisms to change size, probably to decrease their size. That would be an example of an abiotic factor. Overhunting on humans' parts might cause populations to change size, a biotic factor. And ultimately, global climate change affects population size. Again, another abiotic factor. So we can see lots of different things can cause populations to change size. And if ecologists want to understand how or to what extent these factors do have a significance, then we have to know how to measure population size. So to review, from our last lecture, we talked about a method known as random sampling. And we said that random sampling, all it is taking a subset, taking a sample from a population, and we have to know, given that sample and given the volume collected, and given the total volume of our area that we're studying, we can determine the total population, and we do that through this equation, through this formula, where capital N is the total population. The lowercase n is the sampled population, lowercase v is the volume collected, and the capital V is the total volume. So we see that the total population is equal to the sampled population multiplied by the total volume divided by the sampled volume, or the volume collected. And we've done a couple problems already there. Which brings us to our second and arguably more accurate, more precise, and more powerful method of estimating population size. We call that method mark and recapture. And really the title of the name itself describes in many ways the method of doing so. But ultimately it's a second method for estimating population size, and we're going to become familiar with it. In fact, next lesson, we will be performing a lab where we put this method into practice. A quick overview or a quick rundown of the method itself is as follows. The first thing that an ecologist would do is that they would capture a first sample, and they would mark that sample somehow. They might mark that sample by tagging an animal. They might paint a tree. They might do something so that when they recapture, they will know which organisms have been captured before and which organisms have not been captured before. And we call that number, the number that we've marked, M. Okay, so that'll be called M. The next step would be to release that sample back into the population. So if it's a sample of fish that we've marked, we will mark that, or collect that fish, mark that fish, release it back. Or if it's a population of turtles, collect the turtles, mark the turtles, then release those turtles. And give it some time, maybe a couple days, for example, so that those marked animals or marked organisms can redisperse themselves or redistribute themselves into the population. After redistribution happens after a time, we will then recapture. And the total number that we recapture is going to be called C. So we've got M for the number we've marked, C for the number that we've recaptured. And in that recaptured population, we might see some organisms that had already been marked. That is to say, they've been recaptured. We'll call that R. So the numbers that have been recaptured will be marked R. And now we can estimate the total population size. Again, the total population size is represented with the variable or the letter N. And we'll be using a particular formula that I'll be telling you about in a second. That formula is this. We're not going to talk too much about the assumptions or why this formula works, but here it is. Here's the formula. So the marked animals in the first sample, that is to say, M. The marked animals in the first sample divided by the total population, N, capital N, should be equal to the marked animals in the second sample, which is to say, R, the ones that were recaptured, divided by the total caught in the second sample. What we're assuming here, and I'm just going to say it briefly now, and we'll talk about it later, is that the proportion or the percentage that were recaptured given the second capture. So the proportion here should be proportional, or the percentage here should be proportional to the percentage of the animals marked on the first time. If that's true, then we can solve for N. We can rearrange our equation and say that our N, our total population, is equal to M times C divided by R. Again, it's important for us to have this equation in our notes. So take a look at this equation again. And again, it should say N equals M times C divided by R, which is to say the total population is equal to the number marked times the number times the second capture or the second sample, all divided by the number in that second sample that were already marked. Here we see a visual representation of this method of mark and recapture. So let's take a look. Let's use a different color here. Let's use green. Okay. So this is our total population. Okay, our total population of dots, or of, for example, let's use turtles. Turtles are easy to imagine. Let's imagine we have this population, turtles, and that we take of this population of turtles, we collect a sample. Here's our sample, and we mark them. That is to say, we put a red dot on their shell, so that we know that we've already captured them. Okay, so we've numbered this, and we count our numbers. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Our number marked would be 12. Our M is equal to 12. And we release these turtles back into the original population. We don't harm them, we don't do anything to them, we just release them. After a couple days, after they've redispersed, and you'll see in this picture, they have redistributed themselves. They're not clumped together anymore. they're redistributed in the population. After they've redistributed, we will capture a second sample. Okay? In our second sample, let's count how many we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Our second sample is 15. And of that 15, we see 1, 2, 3, and 4. We see 4 were recaptured. Okay. Now we can estimate the size of this population. We could certainly count this population because we can see the total population, but we're going to estimate it regardless. And so we're going to say our total population, N, is equal to M, which is 12, times C, which is 15, divided by 4, which is R. After we perform some calculations here, we can ultimately calculate that our total estimated population size, N, is equal to about 45 turtles. All right, and so that's our estimated population, given our mark and recapture technique. All right, so I think we're ready for a couple more examples. We're going to work one example. I'm going to work one example with you or for you. That'll be example 1, and then example 2, you'll be expected to perform on your own. After that second example, you'll be asked to complete a worksheet, and that worksheet will be due on Friday. So here's our first example, and again, we're going to identify the variables that we've already identified, or that we've discussed. The example 1, you want to know, again, we're talking about turtles again, you want to know how many box turtles are in a forest. On the first day, you hunt through the woods and capture 24 turtles. You place a spot of paint on each of their shells and release all the turtles back where you found them. A week later, you return and catch 60 turtles. Of those 60, 15 of them were marked already, and 45 of them were unmarked. What is the size of the turtle population? So quickly, let's identify the things we know. The 24 turtles that we originally captured, we can identify that as M. That's our first sample. The 60 is our second sample, which is the variable C. And then of that 60, or of that second sample, we saw that 15 were already marked. That is to say, they were recaptured. We'll call that R. Now we're ready to use our equation to estimate the total population size of these turtles. So let's rewrite the information that we know. We know that M is equal to 24. We know that C is equal to 60. And we know that R is equal to 15. And we know that our total equation is N equals M times C divided by R, which is equal to 24 times 60 divided by 15. After we do a calculation, we see that the total population size estimate is about 96 turtles. So that forest has approximately 96 turtles. Now, this isn't a perfect number, but it does give ecologists some indication, some probably relatively precise indication of how big that turtle population is. Now, if it's 97 or 98 or 95 or 94, well, that's true. It might not be exact, but it does give us a ballpark that we can use to work with. All right, here's a second example that I'd like you to work out on your own, and we'll talk about it in class on Friday. Here's our second example. A scientist marked trout in a small Norwegian lake to estimate the size of the trout population. He marked and released 109 trout, his first sample. In his second sample, he caught 177 trout, of which 57 were already marked. What is the estimated size of the population? Now I'd like you to record the things that you know, make sure to identify the correct variables, plug in the equation or the formula, and solve the problem. And after you've solved that problem, then you should receive a worksheet that helps you continue to practice the method of mark and recapture, or at least the math of mark and recapture, so that we can be ready and prepared to do this experiment on Friday during class. All right, and finally, since I've not been in class for the last 2 classes, I want to make sure that we are organized in terms of the work that we should have completed and the work that we will turn in on Friday. So up to this point, last Friday, you should have completed the deer and wolf population worksheet. Okay, so I will expect to have those on Friday. Secondly, last class, you should have completed the population ecology worksheet after you had watched the short video on endangered and threatened species, as well as limiting factors and so forth. Okay, we'll continue to talk about that as well. Along with that population ecology worksheet from last class, you should have watched the population ecology video lecture about random sampling and completed a Google form. That Google form is due by Friday. And finally, the worksheet that you're completing in class today, the mark and recapture worksheet. That is also due on Friday. Now, I know this is a lot of work, but it's work that has been spread out over a period of a week. So if you have questions, make sure to email me or see me during school later today or tomorrow during break or lunch. All right. Good luck, and I'll see you guys on Friday.